which my son is proud of what we do in a world and a job that actually does impact people's lives for the better.
In this video, we're diving deep into one of the most explosive royal stories of our time. A story that involves secret councils, forensic investigations, financial trails, and a single signature that may have changed the lives of two innocent children forever. If you've been following the ongoing saga between Prince Harry and the British royal family, you think you've heard it all. But trust me, what we're unpacking today goes so much further than anything that's made headlines. Stay with me, because this one is going to leave you with a lot to think about. Let's set the scene. Harry has been living in Montecito, California for years now, and while the life he's built there looks comfortable from the outside, the reality underneath was anything but peaceful. The distance from the royal family wasn't just a matter of miles. It was emotional, institutional, and growing heavier with every passing year. The longer he stayed away, the more he could feel the doors quietly closing behind him. Not just for himself, but for his children. Archie and Lilibet were growing up in California, living a life that looked fine on the surface. But Harry knew exactly what they were growing up without. The recognition, the protection, the place in the family that he believed was theirs by birthright. And that feeling wasn't fading. It was getting louder, more urgent, more impossible to ignore. So Harry made a decision. He was going to settle this once and for all. Not with emotions. Not with another interview that would generate a news cycle and then disappear. Not with another round of public back and forth that led nowhere. He was going to use something the palace couldn't argue with. He was going to use science. He put together a 72-page file. Take a moment to really think about what that means. 72 pages. This wasn't a frustrated letter dashed off in the middle of the night. This was a meticulously constructed, carefully organized dossier. It contained DNA tests from a high-end California laboratory. It had affidavits. It had medical records prepared by Beverly Hills doctors. Every angle covered, every base touched. He had built something that he genuinely believed was bulletproof, and honestly, you can understand why he felt that way. He was coming to his brother with facts, with data, with professionally prepared paperwork. In most situations, that's exactly the kind of thing that ends an argument. You put the evidence on the table, the other side looks at it, and you move forward together. Harry had convinced himself that this 72-page file was the peace offering that would finally open the gates. That the palace would look at what he had compiled and have no logical reason to keep his children on the outside. He sent the entire file to William at Clarence House and waited. He probably expected a phone call, maybe a meeting, at the very least, some kind of acknowledgement that the material had been received and that things were moving in the right direction. What he got instead was something completely different. The silence on the other end wasn't the silence of someone thinking things over. It was the silence of someone who had already decided what the next move was going to be. And it had nothing to do with being brothers. Because William didn't pick up the phone. He didn't arrange a family sit-down. He didn't respond the way a sibling responds when his brother reaches out with an olive branch. Instead, he did something that tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the palace was taking this situation. He assembled a council. A group so secretive that most people have never heard of it, and that's completely intentional. These weren't advisors in the traditional sense. These were intelligence officers, elite lawyers, and royal archivists who only get called in when something at the very core of the family is being questioned. Harry had walked in thinking he was starting a conversation. What he had actually done was trigger a process that had been sitting in the shadows, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. The 72 pages he thought would set his children free had just become the most scrutinized file in the building. And the people reading it weren't looking for reasons to say yes. They were looking for reasons to say no. This group is known as the Sovereign Succession Security Council. And you haven't heard of it before because you were never supposed to. That is the entire point of it. This isn't a group that shows up at public events or gives press interviews. They don't have a website. They don't issue statements. They exist entirely in the background, operating in the shadows of the palace by deliberate design. They are made up of intelligence officers, elite lawyers, and royal archivists, people who have spent their entire careers dealing with situations the palace never wants to become public. They are not called in for everyday disagreements or routine family tensions. They only appear when something at the very heart of the institution is being seriously questioned. The fact that William called them in at all tells you this was not a brother receiving an olive branch. This was an institution deciding to protect itself. And they got to work fast. They took what Harry had sent and went through it with a level of attention to detail that most people will never experience. Page by page, line by line, hour by hour. They weren't reading it the way Harry intended it to be read, as a collection of facts pointing toward one clear conclusion. They were reading it the way investigators read something they already suspect has problems. Looking for gaps. Looking for inconsistencies. Looking for anything that contradicted anything else. And here's the thing. They found things. Within hours, the council issued what insiders reportedly started calling the royal freeze. Their conclusion was that the information Harry had provided was severely inconsistent and contradictory. Not in one isolated place, across the material. Think about what that means for Harry. He had spent significant time and money building what he believed was an airtight case, and within hours, not days, not weeks, the palace's own council had looked at everything and said none of it held up the way he thought it did. And then the investigation shifted into an entirely different gear. Because it turned out the questions being raised weren't just about paperwork. The palace has a media forensics team. These are real specialists whose actual day-to-day job involves identifying manipulated images, deepfakes, digitally altered photographs, and staged media content. They are the people the palace calls when something visual doesn't look right, and they need to know exactly why. Sharp, technical, and detail-obsessed. At some point during this process, they were assigned to examine Meghan's 2019 pregnancy. Specifically, they zeroed in on a date, March 5, 2019. On that morning, Meghan attended a public engagement. In the photos and footage from that event, her baby bump looked exactly the way you would expect it to look at that stage of pregnancy. Large, low, and consistent with someone in their final trimester. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would make anyone look twice. But then, 6 hours later, she appeared at a second engagement on the same day, and something had changed. The bump looked different. Not slightly different in the way that lighting or clothing can alter an appearance. Noticeably different. It was higher, it was smaller, and there were what the team described as strange creases visible under her coat, in a spot where you simply would not expect to see them on a human body at that stage of pregnancy. The average person looking at two photos from the same day might chalk that up to a different outfit, a different angle, a long day, but this team wasn't approaching it casually. They ran a three-dimensional depth mapping analysis on her silhouette from both appearances. That means they weren't just comparing photos side by side. They were reconstructing the shape and physical behavior of what they were studying in 3 dimensions. And what that analysis came back with reportedly stopped the room. Their conclusion was that the material behavior visible in the second set of images was not consistent with human skin. The way it folded, the way it sat, the way it responded to movement, it matched the behavior of a synthetic material, not a loose coat, not fabric bunching, a shape device worn underneath, designed to create a specific visual appearance. Now, that is an extraordinary conclusion to reach, and it's worth being clear that a conclusion like this opens up far more questions than it answers. If what the forensics team was studying wasn't what it appeared to be, then what was actually happening? Where was the real pregnancy? What were people not being shown? Those questions didn't have answers yet. But the fact that they were now being asked seriously by palace specialists using technical analysis completely changed the atmosphere inside the institution. Because up until this point, doubts about Archie and Lilibet's story had mostly existed in the background. Online speculation, tabloid whispers, the kind of thing that serious people publicly dismissed. Now, the palace's own forensics team had put a finding on the table that couldn't simply be waved away. And once that happened, the entire investigation shifted gear. They weren't just reviewing paperwork anymore, they were looking at the full picture. And what kept coming back didn't add up. Here's something most people don't think about when it comes to royal births. In the world of the British royal family, the arrival of a child who sits close to the line of succession is treated more like a major institutional event than a private family moment. There are protocols. There are people whose entire job it is to be present, and those people being present is not optional. Think about the births of George, Charlotte, and Louis. Every single one of those births had the royal household's top doctors present. Not nearby, not on call, in the building. These are medical professionals specifically attached to the royal family, and their role at a birth isn't only medical. It's about verification, about creating an unbroken, witnessed record that stretches back generations. It's how the family has operated for centuries, and it has never been skipped. So when investigators started examining the circumstances around Archie's arrival, the absence of those same doctors wasn't a small administrative footnote, it was glaring. And it didn't stop at the doctors. There was no hospital discharge data showing up at the record office either. The kind of paperwork generated automatically when a birth happens through the proper channels simply wasn't there. You might think, maybe they just wanted privacy. Maybe they made a personal choice to do things differently, and that's their right. And that's a fair thought to have. But the absence of those records wasn't just unusual in the context of how the family operates. It created a situation where nobody from outside the immediate circle could confirm what had happened. No record, no independent witness, just the word of the people involved. And then came the birth certificates. A full month after Archie was born, the paperwork was quietly amended. The name on the certificate was changed. Originally, it listed Rachel Meghan Markle. A month later, that was swapped out for Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex. The Sussex camp explained this by saying the palace had requested consistency across royal paperwork. Reasonable enough on the surface, but when investigators checked how Kate's certificates had been handled, that explanation didn't hold up. Catherine is listed on all of her children's certificates as Catherine Elizabeth Middleton, her actual name, no title, no formal designation, just her name, the same way it would be handled for anyone else. There was no consistency requirement being applied there, which meant the explanation for why Meghan's certificate was changed a month after the fact did not actually reflect how the same process had been handled before. Taken individually, any one of these details might be explainable. Doctors not present. They wanted privacy. No discharge records. They chose a different path. Certificate amended. Administrative request. But when you line them all up together, the picture they paint is different. Each gap on its own is a question. All of them together start to look like a pattern. And patterns are exactly what the people running this investigation were trained to find. Then came something that shifted everything into a completely different dimension. Because when a financial audit was run on the Sussex finances, what emerged wasn't a question. It was a number. A very specific number. The audit uncovered a wire transfer. $499,000, sent on May 1st, 2019, just 5 days before Archie was officially announced to the world. Think about that timing. 5 days before the announcement. Not months before, not a year before. 5 days. That detail alone made the people examining this sit up straight. But it wasn't just the timing, it was where the money went. The transfer didn't go to a hospital. It didn't go to a doctor in the UK or anywhere straightforward. It moved through a Delaware shell company first, then through a Swiss intermediary, and finally, it landed at a private reproductive health clinic in Tijuana, Mexico. A facility specifically known in certain circles for one thing: high-end surrogacy arrangements and total ironclad privacy for the people who used it. And the audit didn't stop at the transfer itself. Inside the files, investigators found references to a non-disclosure agreement connected to the clinic and an unnamed third party. Buried in there was a coded internal memo that used a specific name for whatever was being arranged. They called it Project Blue. That name, clinical, coded, deliberately vague, told its own story. When you give something a project name and hide it behind shell companies and Swiss accounts, you're not trying to be discreet. You're trying to make sure nobody ever finds it. When Harry was brought in and shown the full financial map, the way the money moved, the layers it passed through, the destination it ended up at, his resolve reportedly broke. Up until that point, Harry had been operating from a position of confidence. He had his 72-page file. He had his DNA results. He believed he was holding an unshakable hand. But seeing that map laid out in front of him was something different entirely. A financial trail that looks the way this one looked. Moving through multiple layers, ending at a surrogacy facility, timed 5 days before a major public announcement, raises questions that are almost impossible to answer in a way that makes the original story hold together. The privacy that Harry and Meghan had fought so hard to protect had stopped being an asset. It had become the very thing working against them most. At this point, the investigation had grown far beyond a financial audit or a collection of photographs. What had started as a review of Harry's 72-page dossier had become something that needed a different kind of authority entirely to resolve. And so a group was assembled that most people will never read about in any newspaper. A group that has reportedly only ever been called together a handful of times across all of royal history. 7 people sitting in a space that felt heavier than most, tasked with making a decision that would affect 2 children who had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. The Royal Commission for Lineal Ethics and Continuity. That name alone tells you how seriously the palace was treating this. This wasn't a committee. This wasn't a working group or an advisory panel. It was the kind of body that only gets activated when the family feels something truly fundamental is at stake. The people in that room included senior legal figures, senior historians from Oxford, and a former intelligence officer whose identity has never been made public and remains classified to this day. Their mandate was specific: determine whether Archie and Lilibet met the standards required to hold their place within the royal family. And this wasn't about popularity or public perception. It wasn't about whether people liked Harry and Meghan or didn't. It was about whether the circumstances of these children's births could be independently verified against the family's own established standards. And based on what the investigation had turned up, the missing doctors, the amended paperwork, the financial trail leading to a clinic in Mexico, that was genuinely in question. Then something happened that added an entirely different layer to the proceedings. A sealed memo from King Charles himself was opened. A letter that reportedly revealed a grandfather who was deeply torn. On one side, there was love. The obvious, human love of a grandfather for his grandchildren, regardless of the noise swirling around them. On the other side, there was duty. The weight of an institution that had been operating by the same principles for centuries and was not about to quietly abandon them. Charles had reportedly given his private approval to withhold hereditary recognition from any child whose birth could not be verified under conditions the family could stand behind. The threshold of trust, in his own words, had been crossed. Meanwhile, Harry had agreed to something significant. He flew into London on a private jet via a military runway. No cameras, no press, just black Range Rovers waiting on the tarmac. He had brought Archie and Lilibet with him, and he had agreed to a DNA test conducted by the Crown's own doctors, overseen by senior royal officials, and analyzed by the Ministry of Defense. The most high-stakes medical appointment in recent royal history, and almost nobody knew it was happening. The results came back at 4:16 in the afternoon. And for a brief moment, it looked like Harry had played his hand correctly. The DNA confirmed with 99.09% certainty that Harry was the biological father of both children. That number should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment the scales tipped decisively in Harry's favor. But then the commission turned to the final page of the report. And what was written there changed the direction of everything. The conclusion wasn't about the DNA at all. It was about the circumstances surrounding it. The finding was that while the children were biologically Harry's, the births themselves could not be independently confirmed against the family's own standards of verification. The missing doctors, the amended paperwork, the financial trail leading to the clinic in Mexico, all of it, taken together, created a picture that the commission could not look past. The DNA had answered one question, but the questions it hadn't answered were the ones that mattered most to the people making the call. While the commission was finalizing its work, Meghan, back in California, made a move of her own. She released a video online. She called it The Eraser, and if you watched it without knowing what was happening behind closed doors at that exact moment, you'd understand immediately why it went viral. She spoke directly to camera. Her voice was shaking. She was composed but visibly emotional. She aimed every word directly at William. She described what was happening as a witch hunt. She talked about outdated obsessions with bloodlines and archaic ideas about family. She framed the entire situation as an act of institutional cruelty against her children. It was raw, it was personal, and it landed exactly the way she intended it to land with the public. The internet erupted within hours, but inside the commission, none of it moved the needle by a single degree. The 7 people in that room weren't watching social media. They weren't reading comment sections. They had a red leather folder in front of them and a decision to make. After the results came through, Harry wasn't taken to a hotel. He wasn't given time to decompress or make calls. He was escorted under royal protection directly to Frogmore Cottage, his former home, closed up and unlived in for some time. It was opened for one night only, and if that detail alone doesn't tell you the tone of what was coming, nothing will. William arrived, and this was not a reunion between brothers. The atmosphere was cold, the house smelled of old wood, there was no warmth, and no attempt to create any. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't sit down. He walked in and placed a single sheet of paper on the table, the suspension order, and he made the situation unmistakably clear. If the Sussex camp decided to fight this publicly, if they pushed back through any channel available to them, the palace would release the Project Blue files. All of it. The financial trail, the clinic, the coded memos. Every detail the investigation had uncovered would become public. And William told Harry directly, that wouldn't just end the titles. It would follow Meghan for the rest of her life. The choice Harry was being given wasn't really a choice at all. Stay in the UK and raise the children as private citizens, or return to the US and have their royal status suspended indefinitely. Either path led to the same destination. Harry had come to London with a plan, with science, with 72 pages of material he genuinely believed was unshakable. He was leaving with a sheet of paper that told him none of it had been enough. At 6 in the morning, he was seen boarding a private jet back to California, shoulders down, carrying a small bag, looking older than when he had arrived. The man who had flown across the ocean hoping to secure his children's future was flying home, having lost that fight completely. Archie and Lilibet will keep their names, but the royal status, the protection, the place in the family, all of it suspended indefinitely. 2 children in California who will grow up, never fully understanding why their uncle drew such a hard line, and a father who crossed an ocean to fight for them and came back empty-handed. Harry had arrived carrying what he believed was an unbeatable hand. He left with the quiet understanding that the game had never been played on his terms to begin with. The bloodline files are locked away now. The full story of what was in them, what was found and what was decided may never be made public in any official way. What we're left with is the outline of a story that moved faster and cut deeper than almost anyone expected. A brother who came armed with science and paperwork. Another brother who responded with something far older and far more immovable. And 2 children in California who will grow up in the shadow of a decision that was made before they were old enough to understand it. The monarchy has survived for 1,000 years, not by being the loudest voice in the room, not by being the most likable, or the most modern, or the most willing to change, but by knowing, with cold and quiet certainty, exactly when to hold the line. This was one of those moments. And the line held. If this story gave you something to think about, please hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this content reach more people who would want to see it. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss a video. We go deep on every story, and there is a lot more coming that you absolutely do not want to miss. Now here's the question I want to leave you with, and I want your honest thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that the institution and its centuries-old standards should take precedence over biological proof when determining a child's place in the royal family, or should DNA always be the final word? Drop your answer below. This is a conversation worth having.